Hi, this is John with Focus Camera here in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm here with Tom, who's a Senior Sales Support Engineer for Sony Electronics, and we're talking about Sony's professional and cinema line today. So we're going to be going up a lot of cameras in the Sony lineup, and two of these guys are the FX30 and the FX3, compact, portable cinema cameras. So you can't ignore the fact these look almost identical. So there's a lot of similarities here, obviously, but what are some of those similarities and what are some of the differences? Why would I pick an FX30 over an FX3 or vice versa?
Yeah, I get that question asked all the time, John, and it's pretty easy answer. But let's talk about physically. Yeah, you're right. If you, at a quick glance, took a look at either one of these cameras, you'd be hard pressed to know which one was which without looking at the logo, obviously. Yeah. We do have silver screws on the FX3, black ones on the FX30. We added that extra little identifier. When you're making the purchase, the FX3 comes with the handle. The FX30, it's an option. So you can still get the handle, which is very powerful in terms of adding extra channels of audio. Then the image sensor itself, that's the real big difference. So we're looking at a full frame image sensor here, 12 megapixel 4K. You're looking at the ability to do Super 35, but only at HD resolution. Now, there's a lot of Super 35 glass out there, as you know.
Oh yeah.
And the FX30 can take advantage of that because at Super 35, which is its native crop, it can record 4K. So no 4K at Super 35, 4K at Super 35. Super 35, full frame. Two major differences. Beyond the cosmetic differences, there's another huge difference in both cameras in how they handle light. So the FX3 is an 800 base ISO when you're in Cine EI, right? You can jump to a 12,800 ISO. It's a high sensitivity mode. Most people say dual base ISO, but the fact of the matter, it's a high sensitivity mode. But at 12,800, I've seen people show me videos of shots done at moonlight. So it's slightly noisier than the original 800 base, but something easily cleaned up in post. Now you move over to the FX30, and you have a camera that's got a true dual base ISO. So now we're looking at 800 and 2500. So the number is lower, but it's actually a true dual base. And what do I mean by that? It means when I switch from 800 to that higher sensitivity 2500, I get zero difference in noise. So I get that increased sensitivity without the increase in noise level. And that's a huge thing. And especially at that price point. I mean, again, there's a price point difference between these two cameras, but for what you're paying for with an FX30, the performance, I don't believe there's a camera on the market that has a dual base ISO like the FX30 has.
Yeah, I shot my cousin's wedding with this, and I was shocked at how far I could push that ISO indoors in a dark church, and it just came out perfect.
Yeah, so if you're in extreme low light, if you're constantly in those environments, well then maybe the FX3 is a better choice. If you're needing an extra boost with the sensitivity, you want it super clean, and maybe you don't have the budget for an FX3, or maybe your grandfather left you some Super 35 glass, because I mean, there's so much Super 35 glass out there, and a lot of that glass has different looks to it, different characteristics. There's anamorphic glass out there too. I know a lot of my customers like to shoot with these low-cost anamorphic lenses, which both cameras can do, anamorphic, and we'll get to the similarities as well. But there's definitely a place for each camera in the line.
Yeah, and I think also, like, if you're looking, if you don't have a big body or a budget, or you have a limited budget, you could invest in really solid glass on this for the body. You know, if you want, you could get a 24 to 70 f2.8 GM2 and pair it with this, if you know that's within the budget now, because you go with this, you know, smaller sensor.
Sure. And the one thing you do have to keep in mind, Sony's got 70 plus lenses. Every lens that we release just seems to get better and better. The FX6, which we'll be talking about in another video, I've got the 28 to 70 f2 on there, and that is just a gorgeous, gorgeous lens. But what you have to keep in mind is when I put our full frame lenses on the FX3, that it's a full frame sensor, I'm going to get the full angle of view, the full, if I'm
full
putting
image
it,
circle.
right,
Yeah.
sure. Whereas if I put that same glass on the FX30, I have to figure with my math, I have to do a little calculating and figure out a 1.5 crop factor-ish. And so a 24 millimeter becomes a 36, and so on.
Yeah, and also that applies to your aperture too. So if you want to know the difference in depth of field, you can apply that crop factor and get pretty close to what to expect.
Sure. Now, I'm sure most folks know this, but there is a one-stop difference in depth of field control when you deal with full frame versus a Super 35. So if I'm at f4 here and f4 here, this is actually equivalent to an f2.8 on a Super 35 camera.
Yeah, I play with that, and that always shocked me. It's like, oh, so it's almost like a stop difference, it feels like. But
it is a stop difference.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at a camera, it's great that you have these two choices. Those are the factors you got to look at. How important is my angle of view? Do I need a camera that's more wide than more telephoto? Do I want a camera that's going to give me more shallow depth of field, potentially? Do I want a camera that allows me to shoot 4K at Super 35? Or am I shooting in extreme low light conditions like moonlight, where an FX3 might be a better choice? So those are your major, major differences, and from those you can truly make your decision. Obviously, price is still a factor, and sometimes budget dictates that. But if you really, if the needle's pointing towards an FX3, it's not that much more that you shouldn't invest into that as, instead.
So what are some setup tips and tricks when someone first brings this home? What is some advice you'd give those people?
Well, John, I think one of the most important things in the camera is that there's a mode in which you can turn on the high temp mode, and that's going to allow you to have longer record times, where if that's not engaged, the camera will shut off in a much shorter period of time, say maybe 15, 20 minutes, possibly 30. High temp mode gives you those extended recordings. So essentially what you're going to do, you're going to power up the camera. It's going to ask you to set your language. You can set up the Creators app, but you can do that later on. So in this case, I'm just going to do set up on camera. Now it's going to ask me to set the date. I put my date in, month, day, year, so on. And now I get to the high temp mode. And it's going to ask me if I want to turn that on. I can set it now or I can set it later. So I'm going to show you both. So we're going to set it now, right here. And then as we progress through the menu of the camera, I'll show you where you can access setting up for later. If by chance you didn't see this video first and you're wondering why your camera's not running as long as it possibly could be.
Okay, so this one's already set up. Can you just show me how to actually turn that high temp mode on?
Absolutely, sure. So you want to select menu, back of the camera, and you want to move all the way down to the toolbox. It's the sort of gold yellow color. And then you're going to move all the way down. There's a couple of pages. You're going to go to where it says power setting option. It's number 8. You're going to go to auto power off temp. Now the default would be standard if you did not turn that on.
Right.
So you simply select that, move your setting to high, and it's going to ask you if you want to set this. The temperature may rise, and you select OK. Now you're all set. You can do those longer recordings.
Fantastic. One of the things I like about the whole Sony lineup is that you can save all your settings to a card and then recover them. So how do we go about setting that, and can we move settings between cameras?
Both great questions. Let me answer the first one. So you can save settings between one FX30 to another FX30, one FX3 to another FX3, but not across different models. That applies for all Sony cameras in the line. To save the settings, which is something that I recommend highly, this is a supercomputer, and sometimes you've got to reset the computer, right? And so it's always good to have a backup, and this way you can create a backup. So what I would do is, right after I set up the camera to my liking, I would go to, again, my setup menu, and I would go to my reset save settings, which should be on the first page of the setup menu. So I'm going to select that. Now I also recommend having a separate SD card. So maybe you had an older one that's sitting in your drawer. Just grab that, format it in the camera, and we're going to go through this setup process, and then keep that one in your bag. So if you ever had to reset the camera, you've got the instant backup that you just load into the camera and you're up and running in no time. Once you've set up the camera, you want to go to the first page of the setup menu, select Reset Save Settings, and you want to grab a card. I've got a card in my camera right now. That's going to allow me to go to the Save/Load settings. So you're basically able to do both things in this same menu. So we're going to select first Save. So we've got the camera set up the way we want it. Now we want to save that spot. So I hit Save. I hit Save to Media. You can also save to the cloud. And then it basically gives me a file name and a time. I do Save New. I can name that whatever I'd like. I'm just going to keep the default and click Save. Now, fast forward, I had to reset the camera for whatever reason, or I've got another FX3 that I just bought, and I want to set that camera the same way I set up this one. So I take that card, put it in the camera, I go to the same menu, Save/Load, and now I'm going to select Load. I select Media, and I select that same file. I click OK, and the camera's going to reboot, and now it's up and running exactly the way you set it up previously.
So I love all the additional buttons and controls on the FX3 and the FX30, but these three up here trip me up. What's the story on the iris, the white balance, and the ISO button?
Aha, you didn't read the manual, so
Nope.
I'll explain. Okay, I love these buttons. They're quick buttons, and they can help you do multiple things. So first of all, each button, when you're talking about the exposure button, so ISO, iris, and shutter, they're all tied to a dial as well. The iris button, number 1, is tied to the dial on the front of the camera, where your pointer finger would go. Your ISO button, the button number 3, would be tied to the dial that's on the back of the camera, near the top, right where your thumb would go. And then your shutter, if we look on the lower right-hand corner of the back of the camera, you have that dial, and shutter is listed at the bottom. So that dial is connected to pushing the dial in where it says shutter. White balance is going to operate slightly different, so we'll skip that one for the end. Okay? So first of all, let's start with the iris. Again, the dial on the front where my pointing finger would go would be where I would adjust the iris. And I can turn that dial in either direction, and I should see a value change. If you don't, the first thing you want to check is the status of the lens. Now on Sony lenses, you have the entire iris range, right, which can be clicks or smooth operation. Well, I want to turn that ring all the way past where it says f22, and I want to move it. It's going to take a slight bit of extra effort to have it click to where the capital red A is. That's basically sending control to the camera versus setting your aperture on the lens itself. Now that we know the aperture ring is in the proper position, we can turn our iris ring, and if it still doesn't move, what we're going to do is tap button number 1, because it's basically a toggle between lock and unlock. All right, you see your value change, right? So once it's changed and we have the aperture set that, to the value that we want, and it's always good practice to set your aperture first, lock that in, because we are dealing with cameras that give you shallow depth of field, and you want to maintain that depth of field unless you're intentionally changing it. So we set our aperture, and now I press number 1 again. Now it's locked in. Now I can't bump that dial and have the aperture accidentally change. Same functionality for your ISO. Button number 3, the dial in the back near the top where your thumb would naturally reach to. We adjust our ISO, and then we lock it in by just tapping the ISO button. And you could check it to make sure, roll the dial again, and you'll see that the value won't change. And finally, the shutter. On the lower right-hand corner, the back of the camera, you'll see a dial with the word shutter along the bottom. It's that directional that you press, pointing it towards shutter, that will unlock or lock the shutter function. So all 3 buttons, lock, unlock for a single press. You with me so far?
Yep.
Great. Now that we've gone over the 3 exposure settings for the first button function, there's a secondary function that allows you to switch between manual and auto. Instead of a single press, it's a long press. So you push and hold number 1, and you'll see an A appear in front of your aperture setting, right? On my camera, I see an A and f4.0 because I have a maximum aperture of 4.0 on this particular lens. If I press and hold button number 3, now I get auto ISO. Now be careful if you have both auto iris and auto ISO on, because they're going to fight each other, right? So choose one or the other. Typically, most people will set their aperture, lock it in, and then if you want to use any function of exposure in auto, you want to first choose ISO. So set your iris and then even set your shutter speed, lock that in, and then push and hold number 3 button, set yourself into auto exposure. Now, if you did want to shoot in auto shutter, you certainly can do that. Again, the same thing applies. That dial on the back, push and hold it just above the shutter, and an A will appear in front of your shutter speed. To get out of that mode, just push and hold again, and you're back to a manual mode. That applies for all 3 buttons, the iris, the ISO, and your shutter.
So that makes sense for those, but what about the white balance?
Glad you asked. It's a little bit different. If I just push the white balance button, I actually go right into the white balance menu. So it's not going to operate the same way where there's a lock or an unlock. You simply jump right into white balance. You have so many different settings. You have AWB, which is auto white balance, the sun, which is 5600. You have shade, you have cloudy day, you have the incandescent bulb, which is 3200 degrees Kelvin, bunch of different fluorescents, even auto white balance underwater. I wouldn't recommend sticking this in your fish tank, at least not without a housing. And then you have the Kelvin, which is the K, and you can go into the right with your directional, and you can set up and dial in the exact Kelvin for your white balance. And then you'll have 3 different memories. So that's one that a lot of people don't necessarily understand. So you select one of the memories. We'll say, let's select number 1. I move the directional to the right, and I hit set. It's going to bring up a little box. I simply point that at a white surface, a white area, and I press the button in. It measures it, and it captures that white balance data. That's as simple as it gets for white balance. What's cool is there's always 2 ways to do something, right? So we have the function buttons on the back of the camera can also get you into that same white balance menu.
A lot of customers love the performance of this. The image quality is fantastic, the ergonomics are great, but they're struggling with the audio a bit. So what are some things they can do to get the most out of that audio for the system?
Sure. Sony has an adapter that allows the use of our UWP-D series mic system, which are available as single and dual channel receivers. We have transmitters that are hand mics, that are lavaliers, that are plug-ons. We'll provide a link here in this video for customers to get to those products. But for the time being, let's concentrate on using the handle, which is, again, included with the FX3 and an option for the FX30. The handle is really powerful. It allows you to use any type of XLR mic as well as a 3.5 millimeter jack. You can use either or. You're going to bring in either 3.5 audio or, as most people would, XLR audio. I get a lot of calls on setting up this, so you're not alone. Right? So we're going to flip up this little panel, and you see across the top, I'm going to really concentrate on the most important settings. Obviously, you have some attenuation settings, 0 being no attenuation, and then we had 10 and 20, so we can add attenuation to dampen the sound. But the one that we really want to look at is line mic and phantom power. If I were at a concert and I was getting audio from a soundboard, I'm going to ask the audio engineer, hey, what can you give me? If they say I'm going to give you line level, you want to match the settings on here to what the engineer is giving you. If they say mic level, you simply switch the settings to mic. Now for onboard mics, you have microphones that have their own power, you're putting a battery in, and then you have other mics that require powering off the camera. That's called phantom power. But it doesn't say phantom power on here, it says mic plus 48 volts. The mic I'm using today is the Sony MS2. It's a stereo mic, short shotgun, and it's got 2 XLR inputs. So I'm going to put one into input 1, the other into input 2. Now because this microphone does not have a battery, it needs to power off the camera. So I'm going to select mic plus 48 volts on both. You have the option of adding a low-cut filter, that's all the way over to the right. And then on the bottom row, you have a dial for each input, and you have the ability to either manually adjust the audio or set it to auto. On channel 2, there's an additional setting that says link. It's basically linking whatever you set 1 to as your level to also be number 2. Okay, so it simplifies everything. That one throws people off just a little bit. Oh, I should note that if you're setting all this up and you're not getting audio, please make sure that the handle audio is set to on. Otherwise, the camera is going to look for audio coming in from the 3.5 millimeter jack on the side of the camera. Let's flip around to the back side. There's a small panel. You lift up that small panel and it says input select. Now your choices are input 3, input 1.2, and input 1. These are the channel 1 and 2 selections. So whatever you select here goes to channel 1 and 2. If I'm using a 3.5 millimeter jack, I have to flip it around to the opposite side, and in the top left corner of the input section, it's hidden behind a little rubber panel, you'll see input 3. So if you had a stereo microphone that you put into the 3.5 millimeter jack, you would simply push your switches up. It's a single switch. Push your switch up to input 3. Okay? It's going to send audio from that input to channels 1 and 2. If you wanted backup channels, it'll also put it to 3 and 4 as well. Now here's where people get thrown off. When do I select input 1 dot input 2 or input 1? If I have 2 connections made, input 1 and 2, like this MS2 microphone, I'm going to go to the center selection, input 1 dot input 2, and it's going to basically put whatever is going into 1 to channel 1, whatever is going into 2, channel 2. And finally, if I were using a mono mic, I would simply connect that to input 1, put the switch down to just input 1, and that's going to send input 1 to input 1 and 2. So it's going to actually make a duplicate of channel 1 on both channels, 1 and 2.
So either way, you're always going to get channel 1 and channel 2 audio.
You're always going to get channel 1 and channel 2 audio. You want to make sure that you're monitoring your audio, and not just with the levels on the screen. Sony makes an entire line of MDR headphones. Beautiful sounding, very accurate. Just plug that into the side of the camera, and you can select which channels you want to monitor. Hear that to verify you don't have any clicking or air conditioning in the background. Because yeah, your levels on the camera will tell you have levels, but it won't tell you if you have other sounds you're not aware of because you're in the middle of shooting.
Yes, there is so much more we can talk about with the FX30 and the FX3, but we just don't have enough time. But we wanted to cover the big questions, the things people ask and people wonder about the most. Thanks again, Tom, for coming out here.
My
I really
pleasure.
appreciate that. Make sure you stop into a store if you have any questions. Check out our website, reach out to our phone sales team. And of course, like, comment, subscribe for more, and thanks for watching.